Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm TX141, but you may call me Paul, welcoming you to an all new Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the newly introduced Nakajima Ki-44-Ia Shoki, a Japanese army fighter coming at a tier of 2 and a battle rating of 2.3. To provide you with a brief historical overview of the Ki-44 in general and the variant depicted here today, we must go back to 1940 and realise that the Ki-44 was a response from Nakajima to the specification issued from the Imperial Japanese Army for the design of a new Interceptor fighter. The plane needed to be a high-speed, high-climb rate platform based on the Nakajima 1250 horsepower Ha-41 radial engine. This plane was to sacrifice manoeuvrability for overall speed and performance. The plane was to indeed be quite the opposite from Nakajima's previous design, the Ki-43. The Ki-44 however was to retain the butterfly combat flaps of the Ki-43 in order to bolster its compromised manoeuvrability. The prototype flew for the first time as of August 1940, undergoing a number of performance trials against an imported Messerschmitt Y9E. It was to beat the Messerschmitt Y9E in these trials, and based on this success, the Ki-44 entered production in the autumn of 1941, with the first variant, as seen on screen today, the Ki-44 Mark 1A. This plane was to be armed with two 7.7mm Type 89 machine guns in the cowling, firing through the propeller, and two 12.7mm Ho-103 machine guns in the wings. The Ki-44-1B, which was to follow, was to switch to four 12.7mm machine guns in the same armament layout, and the Ki-44 Mark 1C was to follow with some minor refinements but used the same armament as the Mark 1B. A total of 40 Ki-44 Mark 1s were produced, with the 1As entering service by the end of December 1941. The plane was to quickly become unpopular with its pilots at the start due to a number of factors. Firstly, the high landing speeds. Secondly, the poor forward visibility on landing and takeoff due to the relative positioning of the engine and the cockpit. And thirdly, the weaker manoeuvrability of the plane by comparison with planes the pilots were used to, such as the Ki-43 and the Ki-27. The next main variant to follow was the Ki-44 Mark II, which arrived by the middle of 1942. This plane was to see the introduction of the more powerful Nakajima Ha-109 engine and the rise of the major production variant, the Ki-44 Mark IIB. The plane gradually won over the respect of its pilots due to its interceptor capabilities, seeing its combat role restrained and devoted to the concept of homeland or territorial defence and the interception of Allied bomber groups. Production was to conclude in late 1944 with the up-engined Ki-44 Mark III, featuring the Nakajima Ha-145 2000 horsepower radial engine, and with a total of 1,225 planes produced over all variants. The plane was to see service up to the closing months of the war in 1945, being gradually replaced by the Ki-84. With our historical overview concluded, let us see how the Ki-44 Mark 1A handles in War Thunder. For today's gameplay, we're on the ground strike map Clift Coast using the following setup. Stealth belts for all of our machine guns. The reasoning is that our playstyle is based around two tranches. Firstly, interception. I climb into altitude and intercepting any foe that is at that given altitude, and that is primarily enemy bombers. Alternatively, our other tranche would be energy tactics, either causing our opponents to stall out behind us and then re-engaging them, or alternatively, boom and zoom passes, which enable us to cut through the middle of the battlefield and pick off opponents at will. In both playstyle tranches, we will need to be able to deliver the maximum amount of damage in the shortest time possible, as we may not always be able to dictate how long we have on target, and the stealth belts will enable this. The 7.7mm stealth belts are comprised in the majority of armour piercing rounds and some additional adjustment incendiary rounds. Meanwhile, the 12.7 stealth belts have two armour piercing incendiary rounds to every single intermediate adjustment incendiary, meaning that both belts will be able to penetrate through key components such as fuel tanks and engine decks or cockpit glass, and either set the target on fire or cut it to pieces. For our gun convergence, we are using a 500m gun convergence, and this is based on two lines of reasoning. Firstly, the fact that when we engage our opponents, we will be attacking from distance, and as a result, the closer and closer we get, the more likely our opponents are to notice us as we come in for a pass, and so we want to be able to open fire at a distance before they decide to react. Secondly, we want to open fire at a distance to avoid taking damage, as we have already seen with our initial head-on pass for our first kill on that Spitfire Mark 1A. just a simple clipping of their 7.7mm machine gun rounds against our oil tank was enough to puncture it. And this is exaggerated even further the more damage you take and the more time on target you provide for your opponent. As a result, a 500 gun convergence will allow us to stay away from especially the rearward facing turrets of enemy bombers, and this means that at 700 meters we can open fire and clip the wings of the bombers and cut their fuel tanks open before re-engaging and setting them on fire or aiming towards the central fuselage. For our fuel load, we are using a standardised 30-minute fuel load to ensure that we have the fuel capacity to make it to the end of the game unscathed. And we now begin our analysis by noting, as we pick off our second target here, the Hurricane Mark IIB, that their durability is significantly more than ours. As we can see, it takes us 2 bursts in order to bring them down, and a fire. And we begin to become a little bit wary when the Hurricane begins to lift up once again in order to try and get a shot onto us, but we break up and see that the Hurricane disintegrates. Our durability is not a key factor on this plane, it's a key weakness. In my experience, I have found that 20mm cannon shells and indeed heavier machine guns, i.e. 12.7mm machine guns, such as the Browning, are very effective at cutting the Ki-44 to pieces. Meanwhile, 7.7mm machine guns, such as those found on the Spitfire, or indeed a number of Tier 1 planes, are reasonably effective against this aircraft. You are going to need 2 decent bursts, i.e. 2 second bursts, in order to bring this plane down. Meaning if your opponent is not too accurate, you can sustain some fire in the Ki-44, although I would not recommend it, as usually when you take hits you are going to feel the effects quite quickly to your control surfaces, and this will compromise the manoeuvrability that the plane has. And when we come on to manoeuvrability, we have to discuss it in terms of the change-up between the Ki-43 and the Ki-44. For many of you, you will have flown the Ki-43 1 and 2 before you've come around to the Ki-44 1A, and what this will mean is that you're going to experience a very unique style of play, because you will be used to an incredibly manoeuvrable aircraft at the majority of speeds. As we cut onto a blend in Mark IV here, we can see how at longer distance opening fire, we're able to set their left engine on fire, indeed their left wing in general, and then cause the blend to burn to death. This is because of our extended gun convergence providing a decent spray at longer distances. As we break around, we see a Hurricane coming towards us. But return to our point on manoeuvrability. You'll have noticed that the Ki-43 is manoeuvrable at the majority of speeds, but with increasing speed that manoeuvrability is compromised to some extent. As we bank around a Hurricane Mark I late edition here, and head past, we take a glancing blow from the 7.7s, and we can see how that has done a little bit of damage to our inner wing structure. We push away here using our superior engine, and indeed our plane is built around speed and performance in general rather than manoeuvrability. But with increasing speed your manoeuvrability threshold begins to increase. I would say at around 250 km/h or less this plane handles like a brick. It really struggles, especially in vertical manoeuvres such as an Immelmann or a Split S. Within the region of say 300 km/h to 600 km/h the manoeuvrability increases with speed, and you will find that the rudder, the ailerons and indeed the elevator all come to life, especially in the region of 450 km/h, making this plane incredibly agile. As we overclimb on an enemy Spitfire here and at the same time contend with the pursuing Hurricane, we see that our climb rate is rather strong, and essentially we can outclimb a good portion of our battle rating contemporaries, although the climb rate of this plane is not the best in class. It is rather comparable to say that of the Ki-43 too, if not actually outclassed by the Ki-43 to a small extent, and it is equal to the MC202 and just slightly better than the Messerschmitt 19 ML3, so this provides some context. This means that whilst you will be able to get to altitude rather quickly, and in some cases you will be the only plane up at high altitude in the early stages of the game, as everyone else is trying to climb, you need to be wary of the fact that you may not always be the top altitude fighter and you may have to fight for altitude dominance. Here we have the Hurricane Mark I late edition following us up into the cloud. As we cause them to stall out, we can see that our manoeuvrability at 350 km/h on the aileron, the elevator and rudder combined is very strong, and this means that we can come around and cut the Hurricane to pieces and set them on fire. Again we can see we have limited time on target, approximately no more than 2 seconds, so we need to make every round count. And the Hurricane begins to burn out here as they disappear into the clouds once again, and we push upwards to higher altitudes. The interesting thing is with this Nakajima engine, the Ha-41, this plane begins to lose performance with increase in altitude, and this is felt significantly at approximately 4,500 meters altitude and upwards. The climb rate begins to deteriorate to a small extent, but as soon as you hit approximately 6,000 meters altitude you are really going to feel this. But for the battle rating and the tier composition, you'll find that most bombers will not be able to creep above say 6,000 meters altitude very early on in the game, so this is a redeeming factor on your side. Here we cause a Spitfire Mark 1 to stall out as again we show our manoeuvrability, even as our speed begins to drop. The most powerful control surface on this plane in my opinion is the rudder, which enables you to perform hammerhead turns incredibly well, and indeed those wonderful stall turns. Additionally, at a speed of 400 km/h, the combination of the rudder and elevator means that this plane can turn incredibly well. And when you bring the ailerons in, you'll find that you will be able to turn with planes such as the Kovlev Yak 1, and indeed, not the Spitfires per se, but you'll be able to manoeuvre well enough to be able to break away from a Spitfire as it is trying to turn with you and gradually begins to outturn you. This means that the plane's turn fighter capabilities are restricted to higher speeds. And indeed, if you can take your foes up to higher altitudes where their engines begin to lose performance if they do not have the superchargers, you may find that you're able to outperform them even in a turn fight or a fight based on manoeuvrability because their engines cannot cope with the altitude. Having picked up our 7th kill on the Ichival, the D3A1, we now notice 2 Hurricanes coming up towards us once again. The Hurricane below us, the closest one at 1.2 km, is gradually losing its energy and having to level out to rebuild it. We intend not to dive yet because this Hurricane, a player who we've already shot down multiple times, is being a little bit smarter now, deciding to keep their energy a little bit higher to make sure they can come around for a head-to-head if needs be. And head-to-head passes are not advisable in the Ki-44 simply because of the durability factor, and also essentially your armament is not enough in most cases, unlike what we saw with the Spitfire Mark 1A at the start, in order to win the head-on engagement. We were quite fortunate there to have time on target which was exceeding 3 seconds, and that the Spitfire was only able to raise their guns at the last minute. We level out, and we can see that our acceleration in this plane is rather good. Even with increase in altitude and higher speed, the acceleration of the Ki-44 is one of its key strengths. This plane accelerates well in the region of 200 to 450 km/h. The acceleration means you can quickly pick up speed and enabling you to pull distance on foes who may chase you. Especially when you have a number of biplanes pursuing you such as the I-153, this is going to be your saving grace. And we now transition from stall fighting and interception into a boom and zoom pass. We can see here that our control surfaces are retained. As we look around to make sure that our opponents are not coming after us, we hear the Hurricane in the cloud layer, and we decide to perform a loop. Reason being we should be able to catch the Hurricane here as we come down out of the clouds. And we can see as our speed increases, our control surfaces handle well, and this again comes around to the idea that our manoeuvrability is very good with increasing speed above 250 km/h. And here we are given a little bit of breathing space as the Hurricane begins to faint away from the clouds, and we come around. We notice they are once again coming out towards us, and this time the Sea Hurricane will be going down. We don't have any more time to mess around, and we're going to show the lethality once again of the stealth belts on this plane. As the Hurricane stalls out, we come directly down on top of them, and as their nose begins to drop, we cut them to pieces. With our 8th kill in the bag now, we begin to go up into a loop once again, making sure, after we've checked around to make sure no opponents are coming up towards us, that we are clear and we can now pick our targets at will. The interesting thing however is, and we will see this very shortly with a boom and zoom pass, as we notice another enemy fighter coming after us, another Hurricane, is that the control surfaces of this plane work better with increasing speed, up to dead on 700 km/h, at which point the roll rate in particular begins to lock up quite severely, and the elevator and the rudder become sticky, very resistant to your input, and as a result this can compromise your boom and zoom passes, requiring a more linear approach. But more on that later. We've already said about at altitude or increase in altitude, the plane's performance begins to wane a little bit in terms of the performance of the engine. So where does this plane perform best in terms of altitude? Well, for the Tyrian battle rating, it is highly unlikely, unless you are pursuing bombers which have been given an opportunity to climb, that you'll be engaging targets above say 5,500 metres, as we cut apart the Sea Hurricane here for what is our 9th kill. And we can see how lethal the armament is once again. So when you are not engaging opponents above 5,000 metres, which is a rarity in my experience, instead placing this plane in an altitude region of somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 metres altitude is a very good spot. Reason being, this means that the plane is right on the equinox of its overall engine performance, and this also means that everything is working as intended. You'll be able to intercept your enemy bombers, and at the same time be able to outperform the opposing fighters in terms of energy performance characteristics, and cause them to stall out behind you, and always have the scope to perform boom and zoom passes. We see the Blenheim diving here, after thinking that they perhaps would go for a head-on with us thanks to their forward facing 7.7, and this is now time for us to commit to a boom and zoom pass. We're just waiting and waiting for the opportune moment, and now we begin. We cut our engine here to make sure our oil doesn't cook, and as we can see with increasing speed, and this plane does not pick up speed too well in a dive, although it is reasonable, it is not going to be outrunning the likes of say a Fokker 190A1 if you happen to be up tiered against one, you're able to get away from some foes, particularly biplanes and early monoplanes. And here we stall Ki-44-10, who is knocked out by one of our friendlies, and we finally pick on an MC202. And we can see how just shy of 700 km an hour we're having to control our speed in order to make sure we have the manoeuvrability to hit the MC202 and pick up our double ace. But if you do not apply speed controls, you may find that your control surfaces will lock up to such an extent that a pass such as that would not be feasible. We now look around and see the Millenniums knocking out the ground targets, and we brake around. We try to go for the Millennium right before the end of the game, as they gradually knock out our ground units. But as we're going to see, our friendly forces are knocking out the enemy ground units a lot faster, and this game is going to come to its end very shortly. Ideally then, in terms of speed range, you want to keep the speed of this plane somewhere between 350 to 500 km an hour where possible, as this is where all the control surfaces respond, and this plane feels incredibly light, despite its heavier nature by comparison with its predecessors, such as the Ki-44. And this is a very strange feeling for a plane based around interception and overall performance against manoeuvrability. And as the game comes to its close, we're about to take a look at the post-game results. With our 10 kills providing 34,896 silver lions and 3,253 research points, we must now come on to how one can defeat the Ki-44-1A in a given matchup. To do so, you need to be confrontational, as you need to deprive this plane of its speed and thereby its manoeuvrability, especially once the speed drops below 300 km an hour. To achieve this, you can take one of two approaches. Either enter 2 versus 1 engagements against a single Ki-44, whereby it will bleed its energy to a state where it is less manoeuvrable and will eventually be brought down by either yourself or a friendly. Alternatively, you can actively pursue it, especially when it is in the midst of a climb, as if the Ki-44-1A is forced into a head-on. Its low durability can mean it will emerge from the head-on, broken into 2 or more pieces, or in flames. Meanwhile, you can fly past in, say, a Hurricane Mark 2B, relatively undamaged with a couple of scratches. If the head-on pass does not work, but you both turn to engage one another again, once this plane's speed drops below 300 km an hour, its manoeuvrability is equivalent to, if not less than that, of say a Lag 3-8, a Yakovlev Yak-1, a Messerschmitt Y-9 ML3, or a Spitfire Mark 1A, and this is where you can gain the advantage, based on your overall player skill and that of your opponent. However, if you enable a Ki-44-1A to gain altitude and enable it to use its acceleration to pick up its speed towards 450 km an hour, it is going to be a very difficult opponent to dislodge. And whilst not replicated in the gameplay today, I have found on a number of occasions this is the one plane that is going to stand between you and your ability to bomb enemy bases, as this plane is able to get to altitude very quickly, although not the quickest in its class, and able to stand in the way of any encroaching medium or light bombers. And we can see here, using energy tactics and an interception role, we came third by comparison to the rest of our team, knocking out a good portion of enemy fighters and knocking down a single Blenheim Mark IV. As a result, if you are used to flying the Ki-27 and the Ki-43, then the Ki-44 is going to be a completely different plane. Reason being, this plane sees a reversal of its overall performance characteristics, and it may come about as a complete stranger at first. But if you keep your speed high and your altitude to a medium to high level, somewhere in the region of 4,000 meters altitude, then this plane is going to be an absolute nightmare, because it is the Demon Queller. And so I've been TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. Yet until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.